This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And this is the 7th of June. The summer is continuing. The prairies are growing. They're very interesting. And we're pleased with the prairie. We've been up there again. And it's just fun to see real prairie plants growing. And we appreciate gates at either end of the old road that gives us access. It's just wonderful. I have been communing with the cemetery managers, and they're letting us use their burn pile. And although we're still working with teasel, it's kind of a mongrel weed. It comes in through the cemetery. It's a very beautiful dried arrangement, and it goes into wreaths, and from there it comes to the neighborhood. And so I wanted to say a few things about just wandering around the prairie. I encountered two small pawpaw bushes. That was kind of nice to encounter. Pawpaw is kind of an escapee from the south. It has many trees in the south, in tropical areas especially, have drip tips because they have huge rainfalls, and the water shouldn't stay on the leaf. So this is a plant that has drip tips. It also has a very tropical flavor. It's like the flavor of a custard apple, somewhere between a banana and an orange, and but it's very tropical. And we speculate that this may have been a plant that adapted to the north and does very well, but it frosts very early, and its behavior may indicate that it comes from the south. You shouldn't mix up spice bush with, which is another shrub. It's both pawpaw and spice bush are aromatic, but spice bush is by far the most aromatic and has much smaller leaves, and the stature of the plant or the shrub is smaller than that of the pawpaw. It's interesting that these plants have become cultivars that are often installed in plant gardens, and there's a little bit of nature there, and so sometimes plots that have these plants become characters of the neighborhood. So it's always a problem when houses are transposed to a new owner, that sometimes these plants that take years to grow are removed, either for safety reasons, so you have a visual corridor, or just that it looks too overgrown, and we've gotten used to things being very neat and tidy. So I was pleased to encounter pawpaw. I grew up with a different pawpaw. It's a papaya, and it grows on a tall palm-like plant, and the fruiting body is about a foot long and very tender. You could get it in the shops, but it's protected in the sense of it has soft materials around it. So it's one of those fruiting bodies that doesn't get moved around very much unless it has the proper treatment. We've had a couple of herpetologists up at the plot, and they've been looking for snakes and salamanders and the like, and they put down flat pieces of cardboard or plywood or even tin, and that attracts mice that have some shelter, and then that attracts snakes that like to eat the mice. So there's an ecology there. Out of curiosity, I lifted one of these tin vents up, and there was a colony of about 20 mice of all stages. Some were mature and could run away, some were smaller, and one mother was still suckling about 6 or 8 young ones, and she couldn't get away from that crowd very quickly. So I didn't take any photographs. I put the lid back down, and so I had upset the nature, but I understood better the relationship of mice as food for snakes. Probably deer mice, and they're part of our ecology. Much of the seed that's in the gravel pit probably get moved by small animals. In fact, some of the seed benefits from that, because the movement of a seed through a gut can influence its success of growing. I was planting some seed that was very small, that should not be covered with soil at all, but find its own way of looking into the soil. I was talking to the cemetery people, and they were suggesting that it was, they'd put probably a cooperative venture with us to put in a Pheasants Forever prairie, which is a kind of simple prairie, but it didn't do very well in the first year, nor in the second year, when they replanted it again. And I said, well, it's a prairie, it's a perennial, and sometimes it will take 10 years before that seed grows into a plant, and you will see the fruiting body and recognize it. So that was a different situation, but it's important, if you put in a prairie, a reconstruction prairie, to have the patience to wait for several years for it to grow and blossom. And you need to have some diplomatic plants, like Canada wild rye is a good one, and bee balm is a good one. And you need some instant gratification where plants will grow in a reasonable time. Indian grass grows quickly. Otherwise, the plants put down the roots first. They're perennials. They're going to stabilize themselves. So the roots take a long time to grow, and then you don't have any recognition of the early growth of the plant. So it's difficult to have that patience which you need. It's not that the seed is no good. That's often what happens if we're so used to having annual corn and soybeans that if it doesn't happen quickly, then it must be something wrong. No, it's going to grow slowly, and have lots of patience, and it will be there. But I got a email from Doug DeLong. He's a bridge engineer somewhat south of here, and he had a picture of a butterfly on Monarder, and so he has acquired 5 acres and is growing prairie. But I had to remind him too that you have to have lots of patience if you plant prairie plants, they're not going to grow quickly. It's a matter of thinking of it. Our prairie is probably at least 80 years old, and it will probably be another 80 years before it looks really good as a natural prairie. So that's my story about regrowth succession. I had some things to say about bumblebees. The plants like monarda or bee balm, as it's called, or it's a mint, and that's a very aromatic flower. The bumblebees love it, but a whole bunch of other insects also like it, including the butterfly that came with the picture. And you need some of that sort of status to give the people who are used to instant gratification something to go along with. So most mixes that you get from places like Prairie Monk, if you explain to them your situation and whether you're near to active park districts that really could use some instant gratification, then they will add some seed that will give you some of that sort of feeling. Some of these things are very spiritual in nature. I had a note from T.J. Jacobs' spouse. He recently died rather suddenly, and they had been partners for a long time in Champaign-Urbana as well as in Colorado. And they'd ridden a bicycle across the country and together, and that so now that TJ is gone, she was riding a mountain bicycle up some of the ridges in Colorado, and she encountered a gentleman who was not sure what was ahead of him, because it turned out to be an elk, and elk are not they're to be respected. If you get too close, they will charge you, and so an entanglement with a rack can be a dangerous thing. So these two people got together and talked, and the elk went away, and the situation was almost a situation where Nancy could communicate with TJ, and just the reminder that nature is rather wonderful, and TJ would have, he was a very astute environmentalist, and he was always encouraging people to observe and ask questions about the wonder of nature. So they're my, let me look at my notes to see if I'm not missing anything. No, they were my initial comments for today. Otherwise, I want to go to a different potential rail trail situation. Some of these things are not easy to understand. They're not always in complete situation. And so I encourage you to go to a computer and look at the maps that where you walk along the old railroad lines or active railroad lines and find where we're working. One of our biggest challenges is to get from the Kickapoo Trail from Danville to Urbana through Champaign-Urbana. Once you do that, you're still working with Oakwood territory. We send people out by Kirby Avenue, which is south of town, and it hits White Heath with much less traffic if you're on Route 10. but we have railroad bed on Route 10, and with a little care and a little tolerance, we could have trails on top of rails. There are ways of letting you know scheduling. There are lights that can be installed to say that the train is coming. But a tourist train is not going to be going at 80 miles an hour. It's going to go with caution. And if you also have the tires covered so that you can run a trail, then you don't have to destroy the prairie that's next door for prairie preservation. So this week I got a note from Ameren to say they're going to work on our right-of-way. Well, it's 33 miles long, but there was no indication as to where. So I called up, and I was interested to understand that this and in other cases, Ameren has employed biologists that understand our requests for no herbicide. And we came out of that with a no herbicide docket, which then you have to hope that the contractors who are working the territory will use chainsaws and not spray in a wind situation that will take the spray further than it should do onto land that is not in the Ameren easement. This week has been an awkward week for herbicides because dicamba has been a matter of a Supreme Court judgment, and dicamba is a useful chemical in that organizations like Monsanto can breed a soybean that will be resistant to dicamba. That means that you can herbicide the weeds without herbiciding the broadleaf soybean plant. The problem is that dicamba is very volatile and it blows, and it goes on to other people's fields. So the court case has been, I think, come to a termination with dicamba being disallowed. That's very disappointing to people who have already paid for dicamba-ready seed and have bought the dicamba itself. But that's part of the problem of going ahead with technology without necessarily testing it enough to know what the problems are. So you're going by the seat of your pants, and if you do that, you're gambling, and that's what was coming out of the Supreme Court. Okay, so we're looking at a rail bed starting in Champaign. It's active to Staley Road. From Staley Road to Seymour, it has been abandoned but not disconvolvulated. That means the rail is still there. So the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad is restoring 4 miles on the other side of the 3 miles, and we're hoping that we can get through to White Heath as a trail. Fortunately, part of it has an interurban corridor which could be a trail. Otherwise, we may have to be on the rail bed itself. You can put a trail alongside a rail, but that takes out the vegetation we're trying to save. And it's not only vegetation, because the railroads had railroad laws, and you could not invade the railroad right away. That's not always true. If you don't have a law activated and surveilled, then strange things can happen. But basically, the area associated with the railroads belongs to the railroad, and it's not to be dug up. So that's where we find our prairies, whether it's in Rantoul or Whiteheath. If we get to Whiteheath, you will have two segments to worry. The Staley, Bonneville to Seymour is still active in rail, so that would mean that we could have rail established without having to re-establish and find ties to make that possible. We don't have the trees of the past to create ties, so we may be involved in cement ties or second-hand ties that have been used elsewhere and that we can use in a frugal situation and still make it work. We're not a major line, so sometimes the seconds that come out of our major line can be used in a minor line. So that's one area that you might look at. Get onto your Google Earth or whatever it is you use for satellite feed and waddle along it. Understand that the bed is active to just west of County Frere. It's where Prairie Gardens is, and then just a little past that, so there's an active line there. And then there's a retired line from Staley, which is just near to where Prairie Gardens is, on out to Bonneville. One of the problems that we have with historic trains is that these are small elevators, so they're selling to farmers, chicken farmers and the like in the south. And neither of us at the Champaign level or they at their implementation area have weigh bridges that can weigh the amount of grain that's being transferred. So we may have to install a railroad weigh bridge. There are already road weight bridges where semi-trailer load of corn can come in, weigh, and they know exactly what they have. In old times, you used to have a weigh bridge in the wooden elevator, but that's kind of gotten cumbersome and it's not used anymore. So you have to have a fairly heavy weigh bridge that'll take a 100-ton vehicle and weigh the contents. You have the weight of their empty vehicle. So we're still working at that, and much work has been done. But we do have an easement for power, and that's where we get involved with herbicide and trying to keep the nature intact. Already we have lost quite a bit of prairie to herbicide. Once you get to Whiteheath, there's a little piece of our railroad bed that doesn't have stanchions on it or power towers on it, and that is we cherish, but we have some debate there because where the Railroad Museum ends, there's been an attempt to put evergreen trees that can become invasive on the very little piece of excellent prairie that we have, that is remnant prairie left. Once you get to White Heath, you have a Y. It's a triangle where you can go 7 miles by active train to Monticello, past the Railroad Museum. The Railroad Museum owns that line. Or you can turn around and there's abandoned bed with no rail on it all the way to Clinton. And we're thinking that that triangle could allow the Railroad Museum or the Champaign, Havana and Western Railroad, which is re-railing between White Heath and Seymour, that area could allow trains to go down to Shady Rest. It's about a mile down to the river on the Sangamon River, and across the Sangamon River. You could choose to do this in just a mile of railroad bed, and you would simulate a Chautauqua of the 1880s, and that could be fun to do. That could be something that could be done irrespective of an overall plan. So some of the things we are doing in this direction are skeletal. We need to maintain what we have now rather than lose it to farming or other uses. It's important that we stabilize this skeleton. If you look a little further and perhaps look another 50 years, that line can continue across the Sangamon, then across the Madden Creek. There's a little tributary that comes in. And then that line goes straight west to Lodge, where it meets another line, and on to DeLand, Weldon Lane, and Weldon Springs, and Clinton. When you get to Lodge, there's a north-south line that goes straight to Bay Mint. It's the sort of place where a grain line that would take grain either north to Chicago or south to Bement and the Walrush line. So it's an active line at the moment, but we watch because as economics are investigated, some of these lines are removed, and you have to be ready if you want to use them in a different manner. But imagine, shut your eyes and think about White Heath near to the Sangamon River, and a rail going across the Sangamon River, across the bottomlands, across the tributary called Madden Creek, and up the hills to Lodge, where you can join another railway that is active at the moment. But if that closed out, you could take the rail historic train south to Monticello and then make a circuit of about 23 miles. Now, that's not easy to do, especially if you only use it several times a year. So there's a cost effectiveness there. But there's also interesting tourism, and that tourism brings money. And you could have a restaurant train that would go around. You could have a special train that would come in from Chicago or St. Louis. So there's a connection there with the Railroad Museum and with other towns. The Railroad Museum currently will allow trains to go to Decatur, and that sort of situation is a possibility we need to leave in action. So going on from Lane, we own the between the towns. We don't own the town themselves because those elevators and town facilities needed that land, and we could go through those towns with a sensible trail. So it's not a continuous railroad, it's a cooperative bench. We're certainly wanting to preserve the prairie. Some of it's gotten dug up. We know that. It's an era of more corn and more soybeans means an income. But on the other hand, if you have very little of your native ecosystem afloat, then you're back to extinct species that we don't know very much about and which we might need for certain chemicals, or actually the plant itself. So we're hoping that what has happened with the Kickapoo Trail to the east and a nice narrow trail between Monticello and its west developments, these are beginning to make a statement, and nationally there are now perhaps between 20 and 30,000 miles of rail trails, and East Central Illinois has not participated very much because the soil that's under those trails is very rich, and we need to make that contact. I'm watching the time here. My watch is not working. Okay, now it's working. So now we're at Lodge, and we have the potential, say, 100 years' time, for a circuit of 23 miles. In the meantime, you take part of that circuit and go down to Shady Rest and hold the Chautauqua. It's a very interesting bottomland forest with some upland forest, some morainic material, wonderful wildlife, and that's now in the hands of the Piatt County Forest Preserve, and in a perpetuity situation that we approve of, and they have the money and the authority and the tax base to be able to put in simple trails and to protect the vegetation that's there. And that's now on a soil and water conservation easement. Go a little further, you can go across the bottomlands and Mountain Creek and up to Lodge. So you can do these things in stages. You don't have to do them all at once. You look at your history and look at your opportunities and do certain things. In order to do that, we have to do a lot of talking. We have to be able to understand what our overall goals are. And that's not always easy because it's been traditional that you could get a few people together and decide to do what they do and do it, and it's done. But that doesn't always meet some of the goals that are around this. That trail goes across flatlands. It goes to Land, to Weldon, to Lane, to Weldon Springs, which is an interesting state park, and right alongside is Clinton Power Plant Lake, another state park, very heavily used state park. And 5 miles of this corridor would connect those two state parks. So we have to keep those overall goals in mind. And that is superior to just picking off the goodies and developing little parts that are not part of the whole plan. So talking to neighborhoods, there's a lot of often resistance to a plan like this. So there has to be good plans, some of them 30 pages long for people who are specialists, and some of them are 1 page long that for people who need to understand the overall objectives. Now, through that passageway, we're looking for connections. And at the moment, there's a rail trail coming through from Bloomington to Farmer City and Mansfield. And Mansfield is not too far away from Lodge and DeLand, and we're looking for connections. The line that goes from Champaign to Mansfield goes to that same line that we were talking about for potential restaurant. So that line is active, and it takes cargo grain from west of Champaign through Mahomet and to Mansfield, where it turns north and south. The line that used to go to Bloomington can now be a trail. And the thing is that it finishes at Mansfield, so you very much need a connection to places like Champaign. We're thinking that at least, lacking any other alternative at the moment, that trail could head south to DeLand or to Lodge, and with a short connection of perhaps 5 or 7 miles, it could connect to any trail that would come in from Whiteheath to Seymour, to Bonneville, and Champaign. It may not be the only alternatives. There are roads and other places that can be shared roads. But in this case, we're looking for a shared railroad line. We'd like the railroad to be able to go to a different site and offer interested tourist people a chance to experience what used to be a Chautauqua, where people, politicians and church people included, and citizens would find shady rest just 15 miles from Champaign, an interesting place to congregate when they could go no further with a horse. A horse would be pooped out after 15 miles. So you have the same situation as you have today with recreational vehicles, where you get families together and you have a corral. Well, you had a corral in horse years too. So we have the potential to be from Bloomington to Champaign. It might be improved. If you had wonders, you might be able to come in on the grain line, but very much doubt that will ever happen. So we have to look for roads to make the connection. Leaving that situation, go back to the Railroad Museum. Look at this on your computer maps. You can get details, surprising details. The Railroad Museum owns a 7-mile line from a Y at Whiteheath. I was explaining before, a Y is a you can turn the plane around and go back with the engine in front. Traditional. The Railroad Museum currently only uses 3 miles of that bed, and the rest remains as storage for ADM vehicles that are not being used at the non-peak time. There are 2 lines there, and the Railroad Museum owns both. It owns the main line, and it owns an interurban, and both are used for storage. So again, we're thinking how people can use some of that territory in a logical fashion. You get to Monticello, and the Railroad Museum has excellent connections to that north-south line that comes down through Lodge and eventually goes to Bementa, the Wabash line. That has other possibilities. You certainly have an outlet for trains to go out onto the main line, or for tourist trains to come in, or for engineering trains to come in. Monticello Railroad Museum has good repair facilities, so you can bring in a piece of equipment from another state, and it can be preserved. It might take a long time to work with it and to deal with improved journals, and perhaps convert it from coal to oil or different things like that. So we have resources that are interesting. We have a city, county seat of Piatt County, and a square that's intact. We have a Sangamon River. We have an Allerton Park. We have a lot of resources there. We have an 8-mile corridor which goes to Bement. That's a separate corridor from the railroad. It's an old interurban line, and if it got the respect that it probably needs, it grows prairie. At the moment, it's well mown for the whole 8 miles, but it could be a natural resource as well as a rail trail. So that resource is there. Most of that, when that train turned west to Decatur, most of that land has been used. Consumed is the term that's used. That corridor that is what used to be the Illinois Central and Gulf, that goes from Urbana not to Mahomet and to Bloomington, but rather to Staley, Bondle, Seymour, Whiteheath, then to Monticello. It goes across the Sangamon there to Armenia and Cisco into Decatur. And from Cisco into Decatur, it is an active grain line. It's not an active working manifest train line. It's a grain line, and it has to be maintained. It could extend back to it could also the bed could provide an opportunity for rail trail, and we've had attempts to do that. But one of the things that we respect, and one of the reasons why we put the line, was for its prairie that's on the line, and we want to keep that. When we have enough discussion back and forth and know what it is intended, we may be able to put a narrow trail along that existing railbed with trestles intact, and allow the public to experience the prairie. But at the moment, I'm not sure how much appreciation there is for prairie, whether it is enough to preserve it, or whether recreation will take over and make a wide trail which will make the prairie objective invalid. So we have some more thinking to do there, but we still have this corridor, and it eventually runs right into Decatur. We have an interesting road that's next door to an interstate highway at that parallels what used to be the old highway from Monticello to Decatur. Those highways were dual. They were wide enough to take two cars in both directions. They weren't dual highways, but they were wide and active highway. They have been retired, so you have a modestly active highway where you could have pull-offs and informational booths, and you're adjacent to Allerton Park, so in stepwise manner you could go from Monticello, the west side of Monticello, extend to the road to Allerton, or then extend to Armenia, which was the farming center for Allerton, and then to Cisco. And you could do that in stages, and then you may want to do it over a 200-year period. And so, again, we're looking at skeletons that are there, and we need to have discussions, often serious discussions that can be rather conflictual, but they're one way of doing things, and they're a way of communicating with all those communities that are going to benefit from this sort of interaction. We'll probably come back to this area because it's very hard for people to understand it. If they go out in the car to have a look at the site, they get confused. It's much better to look at a map, and we can provide maps and let you know what we're thinking about. It's only a thought process, but we're fairly committed to making sure that it has an overall plan. That means we can use people who can work with computers, can work with the aerial photography, the satellite images, and make it possible to work that area. Once you have a real estate, that's not enough. You really have to maintain it. So we have to burn periodically. We have to make sure that the trees don't short to the power line. So if we're going to get a no herbicide docket on Route 10, then we need to make sure that we don't have any sapling trees growing. We need to know what sort of herbicide is used for spot herbiciding. Raw Roundup probably is more effective for us to have additives, and sometimes it's the additives that make an herbicide dangerous. There are other offshoots from this. Allerton Park would like to have trails, and do have trails, on their roads. They're shared roads for bicycles. There are other connections other than to Bloomington. Some of the prairie spots belong to the Champaign and Piatt County Forest Preserves. And this all connects back to the Kickapoo Trail and to Danville, and even into Indianapolis if we like to think about it in the future. I'm going to quit because I don't know how much time I've used, and I'm going to leave that for the moment. Jason, do you know what time is available?
Yeah. You're at 49 minutes right now.
Okay, well that leaves 10 minutes for some promotion for WEFT. I will say that WEFT was on Zoom this Thursday, and they had an associates meeting with at least 17 people on Zoom, and I thought it was a very good meeting. I managed to run out of battery but I got most of the meeting, and I think we're going to acquire the possibility to organize a Zoom facility ourselves. It's about $15 a month, and I think it's well worth it. You then have to have respect. That means you have to be recognized as someone that is the manager. You have to have someone to hand over to in case you die, and you have to have people that are on your retinue of members. So there's some organization to do there, but it's being used excessively, or I don't know about excessively, it's being used very effectively during the virus holdover. So I thought that was excellent. And just little things that are interactive. Just this week we've been talking about Uncle John Coleman, who used to run the Old Timers. But he had a lot of recordings that were vernacular recordings, and at some stage we had some contact with the federal chamber. I'm thinking not right, but it's the Library of Congress, and so just the little things that are around what we do make it very positive, and that includes working with the Banner Public Television, and we've enjoyed doing that no end. So with this, I'll close. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial, and it's the 7th of June. Thank you.